If you think a single small decision can't change your entire life, you've never picked up something that wasn't yours on a rainy street at midnight. I still remember that night like it never ended, like the cold stayed inside me long after the rain stopped falling. My name is Emily Carter, and I had just finished a double shift at a small diner on the edge of Manhattan, the kind of place where the coffee is always burnt and the clock always moves too slowly. It was just past 1:10 a.m. when I stepped outside, pulling my thin jacket tighter around me as the rain hit the pavement in sharp, restless waves. The city looked different at that hour, quieter, heavier, like it was holding its breath. I started walking toward the bus stop when I saw it, a black leather wallet lying near the curb, half soaked under the streetlight. For a moment, I hesitated, telling myself to keep walking, that it wasn't my problem, that someone else would come back for it. But something about the way it sat there, untouched in the rain, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I knelt down and picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, expensive, the kind of thing you don't just drop by accident. I looked around. No one. Just the soft hiss of tires in the distance and the rain tapping against metal signs. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, expecting credit cards, maybe an ID. Instead, I saw something that made me pause longer than I should have. A sleek black card with a name printed in clean, sharp lettering, Dominic Moretti. Below it, a symbol I didn't recognize, something subtle but intentional, like it belonged to a world I had never been invited into. There was also a folded receipt, oddly formal, and a small photo tucked behind the cards, the edges slightly worn, like it had been handled often. I shouldn't have kept looking, but curiosity is a dangerous thing when you're tired and alone in a city like New York. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I almost dropped the wallet. I stepped back under the weak glow of the streetlight, heart beating a little faster now for reasons I couldn't define. That was when I noticed the car. A black sedan across the street, engine running but lights off, parked too still to feel casual. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just another driver waiting out the rain. I closed the wallet quickly, holding it tighter than before, deciding I would take it to the nearest police station in the morning. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. That strange, invisible pressure of being watched. I didn't see him yet, not clearly, but I knew somehow that I wasn't alone anymore, and that whatever I had just picked up in the rain was already connected to something far larger than I could understand. The moment I turned away from the curb, the rain felt heavier, like the city itself was pressing down on my shoulders. I kept the wallet tucked under my jacket, my hand wrapped around it without thinking, as if letting go would somehow make everything feel more real. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an expensive lost item and nothing more, but my thoughts kept circling back to that name printed so cleanly on the card. Dominic Moretti. Even saying it silently in my head felt strange, like it belonged to someone who lived far outside the world I knew. I walked faster, heading toward the nearest open convenience store where I could sit for a moment, maybe call a non-emergency line and report what I had found. The streetlights flickered above me, casting uneven shadows across the wet pavement. Every sound felt louder than usual, the distant hum of engines, the drip of rain from awnings. Even my own footsteps seemed to echo in a way that made me uneasy. When I reached the small store on the corner, I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth and the soft glow of fluorescent lights. The cashier barely looked up as I shook off the rain from my jacket. I moved toward the back counter, placing the wallet down carefully and opening it again just to confirm I had seen everything correctly. That same black card was still there, still sharp, still unsettling in its simplicity. I exhaled slowly, pulling out my phone to take a picture of it for reference. But as I raised the camera, I noticed something that made my breath catch slightly. The glass door of the store reflected the street behind me, and in that reflection, the black sedan I had noticed earlier was still there, parked across the street, its engine still running. My fingers tightened around the phone without meaning to. I told myself it could be anyone, just a car waiting out the rain. Nothing unusual, nothing connected to me at all. I turned slightly, pretending to browse the store shelves, trying to calm the sudden tension in my chest. That was when the bell above the door chimed softly. A man entered. He did not look rushed, did not look like someone escaping the rain. He simply walked in with quiet certainty, shaking a few drops of water from his dark coat. He paused for a moment, scanning the store with an expression that was unreadable. Then his eyes landed on the counter where the wallet sat. Something about the way he looked at it made my stomach tighten. Not surprise. Not relief. Recognition. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, stopping just a few feet from me. The air between us felt different, heavier, like the space itself had changed shape. I instinctively placed my hand over the wallet, not fully understanding why. He spoke then, his voice calm, controlled, almost too steady for the situation. He said nothing about anger or accusation. Instead, he simply asked where I had found it. The question should have been simple, but the way he asked made it feel like the answer mattered more than I could possibly understand. I told him the truth, that it was on the sidewalk a few blocks away, that I had only picked it up because it looked lost. He listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving my face, as if he was measuring something beyond my words. When I finished, he nodded once, slowly, then glanced toward the window behind me. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city in blurred light, and for the first time since I had picked up that wallet, I realized I was no longer sure if I had found it by accident at all. The man in front of me did not move closer, yet it still felt like the space between us had narrowed in a way I could not explain. His eyes remained on the wallet, then briefly shifted back to me, calm and unreadable, like he was trying to decide something without speaking it out loud. The sound of the rain outside the convenience store grew softer in my awareness, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. I kept my hand on the wallet, not because I thought I could protect it, but because letting go suddenly felt like stepping into something I did not understand. The man finally spoke again, his voice even and controlled, asking if anyone else had seen me pick it up. The question made no sense at first. Like it carried weight I was not prepared to interpret. I shook my head slowly and told him I had been alone. His expression did not change, but something subtle shifted in the way he stood, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. He reached into his coat, not quickly, not threateningly, just with deliberate calm, and I instinctively stiffened even though he was not reaching toward me. Instead, he pulled out a phone, looked at it briefly, and typed something with his thumb. I could not see the screen, but the action alone made my pulse quicken for reasons I could not justify. After a moment, he placed the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the door again. Outside, the black sedan remained parked across the street, rain sliding down its windows in thin streaks. I suddenly became aware that I had stopped breathing normally. The man's attention returned to me, and he asked if I had opened the wallet beyond what I had already seen. I hesitated before answering honestly, saying I had only looked at the identification card and nothing more. At that, something almost imperceptible crossed his face, not relief, not concern, but confirmation, as if I had just unknowingly passed a test I did not know I was taking. He stepped slightly to the side, giving a clearer view of the door behind him, and for the first time I noticed another man outside the store window, standing under the awning, dressed too formally for a rainy street corner at 1 a.m. My grip tightened again without intention. The man inside the store noticed my reaction and followed my gaze, then spoke softly, almost as if he was explaining something simple. He said I had found something that did not belong in ordinary hands, and that the situation I was now standing in was no longer about a lost wallet. His tone remained steady, but the words carried an unsettling clarity that made the room feel smaller. I asked, quietly, what he meant by that, and for the first time, he paused before answering. When he finally spoke, he told me that sometimes objects do not get lost by accident, and sometimes the people who find them are not chosen randomly. The rain outside intensified again, tapping harder against the glass, and I realized I was no longer just holding a wallet, but standing in the middle of something that had already been in motion long before I ever stepped onto that street. The words he said lingered in my mind like a sound that refused to fade, repeating itself in quieter and more unsettling ways the longer I stood there. Not chosen randomly. I tried to make sense of it, to reduce it into something logical, something that belonged in the real world I understood, but nothing about the situation felt ordinary anymore. The man inside the store watched me carefully, as if he could see the exact moment my thoughts began to spiral. Outside, the rain pressed harder against the glass, distorting the street into shifting shapes of light and shadow. The black sedan was still there, unmoving, and now I noticed something I had missed before. The engine was not just running, it was idling with purpose, steady and controlled, like it was waiting rather than parking. I swallowed slowly, my grip on the wallet tightening again, even though I knew it did not offer any real protection. The man finally gestured slightly toward the counter, telling me to place it down. His voice remained calm, but there was an undercurrent of certainty that made it difficult to refuse. I hesitated only a moment before doing as he said. The instant the wallet touched the counter, he slid it closer to himself without touching it directly, studying it like it carried meaning far beyond its physical form. Then he looked at me again and asked if I had been contacted in any way since finding it. The question startled me, because it suggested something I had not even considered, that this entire moment might already be part of a sequence I had unknowingly stepped into. I shook my head, telling him no one had contacted me, no calls, no messages, nothing at all. He nodded slowly, almost as if that answer fit into a pattern he already understood. A long silence followed, filled only by the steady sound of rain and the distant hum of traffic passing through wet streets. I found myself glancing again toward the window, where the second man outside remained in place, his posture still and alert, as though he had been waiting for a signal. I asked, carefully, what exactly was happening, but my voice came out quieter than I intended. The man inside the store did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the door, then back at me, and for the first time his expression carried something closer to caution than control. He told me that what I had found was not simply a misplaced object, but something that had been deliberately separated from its owner for reasons that did not concern ordinary people. The way he said ordinary made it clear I was being placed outside of that category in a way I did not consent to. I stepped back slightly without realizing it, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. He noticed, but did not move toward me. Instead, he simply said that leaving now would be the safest option if I had no intention of becoming involved further. The word involved felt heavier than everything else he had said combined. My mind raced, trying to connect fragments that refused to align. The wallet, the car outside, the man who had arrived without urgency, the way everything felt observed rather than random. I asked one last question, barely above a whisper, asking who Dominic Moretti actually was. At that, the man's gaze shifted downward for a brief moment before returning to me. When he spoke, his answer was simple, but it changed the way the room felt. He said Dominic Moretti was not someone who loses things by accident, and he was certainly not someone who lets them remain lost for long. Outside, the rain seemed to soften for a moment, and in that brief quiet, I realized that whatever path I had stepped onto began the moment my hand closed around that wallet on the empty street. I did not realize I had started holding my breath again until the man inside the store quietly told me to sit down. His voice was not harsh, but it carried a kind of finality that made my legs obey before my mind could argue. I sat on the small stool near the counter, my hands resting in my lap, trying to steady the strange feeling building inside my chest. The wallet was no longer in my possession, yet somehow I felt more connected to it than when I was holding it. The man remained standing, his attention divided between me, the object on the counter, and the street outside where the black sedan still waited under the rain. After a long pause, he asked me if I had anywhere safe to go tonight. The question caught me off guard because it assumed something I had not yet admitted to myself, that staying where I was might not be safe at all. I hesitated before answering honestly that I lived alone in a small apartment about 15 minutes away by bus. He nodded once, as if noting the information rather than reacting to it. Then he told me that it would be better if I did not return there immediately. My stomach tightened at that statement because it was not phrased like advice. It was spoken like awareness of something already in motion. I asked him what he meant, but instead of answering directly, he glanced toward the window again. The second man outside had not moved, yet the way he stood made it clear he was not simply waiting. It felt like he was holding position, maintaining awareness of everything around him, including me. The man inside the store finally exhaled slowly and said that once a connection is acknowledged, even unintentionally, distance stops being protection. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the air feel colder. I looked down at my hands, realizing they were trembling slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. I asked again who Dominic Moretti was, this time more directly, because I needed something solid to hold on to in all this uncertainty. The man studied me for a moment longer before answering. He said Dominic Moretti was someone who built his world on control, not chaos, and that anything connected to him was rarely allowed to remain outside of his awareness for long. He did not elaborate further, but the silence that followed felt more informative than any explanation. Outside, the black sedan finally turned on its headlights, not aggressively, not suddenly, but with a smooth certainty that made my attention lock onto it immediately. The engine shifted from idle to movement without hesitation, and the vehicle began to roll forward slowly along the curb. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched it pass the storefront, not stopping, not rushing, simply moving as if confirming something before continuing on. The man beside me followed its movement with his eyes, then returned his attention to me, and said quietly that whatever decision I made next would matter more than I understood right now. I sat there, unable to fully process the idea that a simple walk home from work had turned into something I could no longer define. The rain continued outside, steady and indifferent, while inside the store, everything felt like it had already shifted into a version of reality I had not agreed to enter. I sat in silence longer than I realized, staring at the reflection of the street in the glass window while the rain blurred everything into soft, shifting lines. The man inside the store had not moved from his position near the counter, but something in his posture had changed, as if he was now measuring time instead of simply observing it. The wallet was no longer visible to me, tucked somewhere out of reach, yet its absence felt louder than its presence had been. My thoughts kept circling back to the name Dominic Moretti, as if repeating it might eventually unlock meaning. But all it did was deepen the sense that I had stepped into something I could no longer reverse. After a moment, the man spoke again, telling me that staying in one place too long would not be advisable. His tone was steady, not urgent, but the lack of urgency somehow made it more serious. I asked him where I was supposed to go, because every option I could think of suddenly felt uncertain. He did not answer directly. Instead, he looked toward the entrance of the store, where the bell above the door remained still, untouched, as if even the idea of someone entering had been suspended. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. The sound startled me more than it should have, breaking the fragile stillness that had settled around me. I hesitated before pulling it out, already expecting nothing normal, and when I looked at the screen, there was no number I recognized, only a single message. It contained a short line that made my stomach tighten in a way I could not explain. "Stay where you are." I looked up immediately, my breath catching slightly, but the man inside the store had already shifted his attention toward the window again, as if he had anticipated this moment before it happened. Outside, the rain was still falling steadily, but now I noticed something I had missed before. The black sedan had returned, not parked this time, but positioned across the street at an angle that allowed a clear view of the store entrance. It was not blocking traffic, not drawing attention, but it did not need to. Its presence alone changed the way the street felt. I asked the man if that message had anything to do with him, but he simply told me that messages like that were rarely sent without purpose. Before I could respond, another figure appeared outside the store, this time closer, stepping out from under the awning across the street. He was dressed in a dark coat, standing still for a moment as if confirming something, then slowly began walking toward the entrance. My pulse quickened again, not from fear alone, but from the realization that events were no longer unfolding separately, they were converging. The man inside the store watched him approach, then finally spoke in a lower voice, telling me that if I intended to leave, I would need to decide immediately. The bell above the door finally rang as it opened, and a new presence stepped inside without hesitation, scanning the room once before his eyes briefly met mine. He did not speak at first, but I could feel instantly that this moment was not random. It felt coordinated, deliberate, like every step leading here had already been accounted for long before I ever picked up that wallet in the rain. The moment the new man stepped inside, the atmosphere in the store shifted in a way I felt more than I saw. He did not look rushed or confused, and he did not scan the room like someone searching for answers. Instead, his gaze moved with calm precision, stopping briefly on the man behind the counter, then on me, then finally on the space where the wallet had been placed earlier. It was not curiosity that he carried, but certainty, as if he already knew the outcome of every possible interaction in front of him. The rain outside continued to fall in steady waves against the glass, but inside the store, everything felt unnaturally still. The first man, the one who had been speaking to me earlier, did not react immediately. He simply observed the newcomer with a controlled expression, as if acknowledging a presence that required no introduction. I remained seated, my hands now resting still on my lap, though I could feel the tension building in my chest with every passing second. The newcomer finally spoke, his voice even and low, asking for confirmation of the situation without addressing me directly at first. The man behind the counter replied briefly, his tone unchanged, explaining that I had found the item in question and that I had not shared it with anyone else. As they spoke, I noticed something unsettling in the way they communicated, as if no unnecessary words were allowed in this exchange, as if everything had already been understood long before any of them arrived. The newcomer then turned his attention fully toward me, and I felt the weight of that focus settle in a way that made it difficult to maintain steady breathing. He asked me to describe exactly where I had found the wallet again, even though I had already explained it. My voice felt smaller than before as I repeated the details: the wet sidewalk, the empty street, the absence of anyone nearby. He listened without interruption, then nodded once, as if confirming a coordinate on a map only he could see. After a moment, he asked if I had opened anything beyond what was necessary to identify the owner. I told him the same truth again, that I had not touched anything beyond the identification card. At that, a brief silence followed, not uncomfortable in a traditional sense, but heavy, like a pause before a decision is made. The man behind the counter finally stood straighter, glancing toward the door again, and I realized that the situation was no longer being discussed as a possibility, but as a sequence already unfolding. The newcomer spoke again, this time stating that the item needed to be returned immediately, and that any delay increased unnecessary risk. The word risk made my attention sharpen instantly, because it suggested consequences I had not been aware of until that moment. I asked quietly what kind of risk he meant, but neither of the men answered directly. Instead, the newcomer simply reached into his coat and retrieved a small device, pressing something once before returning it without explanation. Almost immediately, I noticed subtle movement outside the store, shadows shifting beyond the glass, as if additional presence had just been activated by that single action. My heart began to beat faster as I realized I was no longer just witnessing a conversation, but standing inside a structure of coordination I did not understand. The man behind the counter finally spoke to me in a lower tone, telling me that I had done nothing wrong, but that continuing to remain involved, even unintentionally, would make things more complicated than necessary. The newcomer then looked at me directly again and said something that stayed with me longer than anything else, that sometimes being in the wrong place at the right time was indistinguishable from being chosen. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping, but inside the store, I felt something irreversible had already begun to move around me. I did not notice the silence fully take over the room until I realized no one was speaking anymore. The rain outside the store had become a steady, almost rhythmic presence, tapping against the glass like a distant signal that time was continuing normally somewhere else, just not here. The two men stood in place, one near the counter and one closer to the entrance, while the newcomer remained between them and me, his posture unchanged, his attention no longer shifting but fixed entirely on something I could not interpret. I became aware of how still I was sitting, how carefully I was breathing, as if any sudden movement might disrupt a balance I had no part in creating. The newcomer finally spoke again, this time not asking questions, but stating that the situation had reached its conclusion. The words were calm, almost detached, yet they carried a finality that made my stomach tighten. I looked toward the man behind the counter, searching for some indication that I misunderstood, but his expression confirmed nothing and denied nothing. Instead, he simply reached for the wallet again and closed it, as if ending a process rather than handling an object. The newcomer then turned slightly toward me and said that I had a choice, though his tone suggested the word choice did not carry its usual meaning. He explained that I could either return to my life immediately and allow everything connected to this moment to remain unknown, or I could continue asking questions and step further into something that would not remain temporary. I felt my throat tighten at the simplicity of the statement, because nothing about the last hour had felt like a situation that allowed for simple exits. I asked him what would happen if I left, and he paused just long enough to make the answer feel intentional rather than uncertain. He said that if I left now, I would likely never hear about any of this again, but silence did not always mean absence, and distance did not always mean safety. The way he said it made the air feel heavier, as if even the concept of walking away carried consequences I could not fully see. I glanced toward the door again, noticing how the man outside had not moved since I first saw him, and I realized that even stillness could feel like surveillance when placed in the wrong context. My thoughts kept returning to my apartment, to the ordinary details of my life that suddenly felt fragile in comparison to everything happening in this small space. I asked the question I had been avoiding, asking why me, why a lost wallet, why a night that started like any other shift home. The newcomer looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice softened slightly but did not lose its precision. He said that sometimes people are not chosen because they are special, but because they are present, and presence alone is enough to change direction. The man behind the counter added nothing, but his silence felt like agreement. I noticed my phone still resting on the counter where I had left it earlier, its screen dark, disconnected from everything happening around me. The newcomer finally stepped slightly back, giving me space that felt more symbolic than physical, and told me again that the decision was mine, but that decisions made in moments like this rarely remained isolated. I sat there, feeling the weight of every possibility pressing inward, while the rain outside continued without pause, as if the city itself had already moved on from the moment I was still trapped inside. I remember the exact moment my decision stopped feeling like something I owned. It happened slowly, not with words or movement, but with the way everyone in the room seemed to wait for me to breathe. The rain outside had softened into a steady curtain, the kind that makes the world feel slightly removed from itself, and inside the store, nothing moved unless it was necessary. The newcomer stood closest to me now, no longer blocking anything, but somehow making the space feel even more contained than before. The man behind the counter remained near the wallet, hands resting lightly on the surface as if it had become part of a procedure rather than a lost object. I looked at my phone again, still lying untouched where I had placed it earlier, and for a brief moment I wanted nothing more than to pick it up and call someone, anyone, who could explain what normal was supposed to look like after this point. But even that thought felt distant, like it belonged to another version of me who had not yet stepped into this night. The newcomer finally spoke again, not repeating the choice, but acknowledging it had already been made in some form, whether I spoke it or not. He said that hesitation itself was a signal that people who truly wanted to leave rarely remained still this long. I tried to respond, but my voice did not come immediately, as if my body had decided to delay cooperation with my thoughts. When I finally spoke, I asked if any of this had anything to do with me personally, or if I was simply standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man behind the counter answered this time, quietly stating that in their experience, those two things were often indistinguishable. Before I could process that, the door chimed again, and the sound immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. It was not loud, but it felt definitive, like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one had finished reading. Everyone turned their attention toward the entrance at the same time. A man entered, not hurried, not cautious, but moving with the same controlled certainty I had now begun to associate with everything I did not understand. He paused just inside the threshold, allowing the rain behind him to settle before stepping fully into the light. His gaze moved across the room once, briefly, then stopped when it reached me. I felt something in my chest tighten, not fear exactly, but recognition of inevitability, as if some unseen thread had finally reached its endpoint. The newcomer beside me did not move, but I noticed his posture shift subtly, as though confirming alignment rather than reacting. The man at the door finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a calm that did not match the weight of attention in the room. He asked for confirmation, not introduction, as if names were already understood and only presence needed acknowledgement. The man behind the counter responded with a single sentence I could barely process, something about the situation being contained and the object being accounted for. I realized then that the wallet was no longer the center of attention, and perhaps it had never been. The man at the door stepped further inside, his eyes returning to me once more, and I felt the air between us shift in a way that made everything before this moment feel temporary. He did not ask who I was, and he did not ask what I was doing there. Instead, he simply said that I had been observed longer than I realized, and that my involvement had already moved beyond coincidence. The words settled into the room like something irreversible. I looked around at all of them, the counter, the phone, the rain beyond the glass, and for the first time since this night began, I understood that my decision was no longer about staying or leaving, but about whether I had already been included in something that existed before I ever noticed it. I felt the moment everything around me stopped behaving like a normal situation. It was not loud or dramatic, but a quiet shift in how every person in the room held their attention, as if they were no longer reacting to events, but following a sequence already written before I arrived. The man at the door had fully stepped inside now, and his presence felt different from the others, not because he moved differently, but because nothing around him seemed to require explanation. The newcomer beside me remained still, his eyes fixed on the interaction unfolding, while the man behind the counter stood with the same controlled posture, as if waiting for a final instruction rather than participating in a conversation. I realized I was no longer being addressed as an individual making a choice, but as a point inside a system that had already accounted for my position. The man at the door looked at me again, and this time his expression was not searching or evaluating, but confirming. He spoke my name, and hearing it in that context made my entire body react before I could even think. It was not the sound of recognition from someone I knew, but the sound of information being verified. I asked how he knew who I was, and my voice came out more unstable than I intended. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, then stopped at a distance that felt intentional rather than casual. He explained calmly that names were not difficult to trace when patterns existed, and that I had been present in multiple points of contact without realizing the significance of any of them. I tried to understand what he meant by patterns, but every explanation I attempted to form collapsed under the realization that I had never been aware of being observed in the first place. The man behind the counter finally spoke again, stating that the wallet had been verified and that the situation was no longer about recovery, but about confirmation. The word confirmation made my stomach tighten because it implied that something had already been decided before I ever entered the store. I looked toward the counter again, noticing that the wallet was no longer visible, as if it had been removed from the conversation entirely. The newcomer beside me finally shifted slightly and said that the purpose of my presence was no longer accidental, even if my actions had been. His words were careful, measured, and they created a sense that I was being placed into something that could not be reversed through explanation. I asked again what any of this had to do with me, and for the first time, the man at the door answered directly. He said that I had interacted with something that belonged to a private structure, and that once interaction occurred, separation was no longer guaranteed. The phrase private structure did not make immediate sense, but the way he said it made it feel like understanding it would not change the outcome. I noticed my phone still sitting on the counter, but I did not reach for it because I suddenly understood that contact with the outside world did not feel like protection anymore. It felt distant, like it belonged to a version of reality that had already shifted slightly out of alignment with the one I was currently standing in. The rain outside continued steadily, but the sound now felt muted, as if the glass between me and the city had thickened. The man at the door finally looked away from me and toward the others, and I realized that whatever decision was being finalized did not require my participation in the way I had assumed. I was no longer being asked whether I wanted to be involved. I was being informed that involvement had already occurred, and the only remaining variable was how I would exist within it. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like a place I could simply stand in and leave when I was done. It was not a sound or a movement that caused it, but the way everyone's attention settled into a single shared understanding that did not include me as a participant anymore. The man at the door had fully integrated into the space now, standing slightly closer than before, while still maintaining a distance that felt intentional, as if proximity itself was being measured rather than chosen. The newcomer beside me remained still, but I could feel that stillness was no longer neutral. It was aligned. Even the man behind the counter no longer looked like someone serving a transaction, but someone confirming the completion of a process that had already been set in motion elsewhere. I became aware that my breathing had slowed without my permission, as if my body was responding to an environment that required caution rather than conversation. The man at the door spoke again, and this time his voice carried a level of certainty that did not invite interpretation. He stated that what had occurred tonight was not random interaction, and that my presence had already been recorded within a sequence of events that extended beyond this location. I asked him what sequence he was referring to, but the question felt weaker as soon as I said it, like it belonged to a version of me that still believed clarity was available on demand. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the counter once more, then toward the newcomer beside me, as if verifying internal alignment rather than responding to me directly. The newcomer finally spoke, stating that the wallet I had found was not an isolated object but a marker of transfer, something used to confirm location, timing, and unintended contact. Hearing this made my thoughts slow, not because I understood it, but because the idea itself carried structure that I could not easily dismiss as coincidence anymore. I asked if I had done something wrong, because that was still the only framework my mind could reliably use. The man behind the counter answered quietly that this situation was not defined in terms of right or wrong, but in terms of awareness and exposure. The word exposure made something inside me tighten, because it suggested visibility I had never consented to. Outside the store, I noticed movement again through the glass, subtle at first, then more defined, as if additional presence was gathering without needing entry. I felt the instinct to reach for my phone again, but I stopped halfway, realizing that contact now felt less like safety and more like separation from whatever rules were currently operating in this space. The man at the door took another step forward, and this time there was no ambiguity in his intention. He said that I would not be left in uncertainty, because uncertainty created instability, and instability was not permitted once a connection had been confirmed. The phrasing made my chest tighten again, not from threat, but from the realization that everything being said treated my life as something that could be categorized and managed rather than simply interrupted. I looked at each of them in turn, trying to find a contradiction, a sign that this was misunderstanding rather than structure, but nothing in their expressions broke alignment. The newcomer finally turned slightly toward me and said that I now had two realities available to me, one that continued as if nothing had happened, and one that acknowledged what had already been seen. The simplicity of the statement felt heavier than anything else because it reduced everything I had experienced into a binary that did not feel like a choice, but like classification. I stood there, aware that the rain outside was still falling at the same steady pace, while inside this small store, something irreversible had already shifted the boundary between what I thought my life was and what it was now required to include. I remember the exact moment the situation stopped feeling like it could still return to something familiar. It was not because anyone raised their voice or made a sudden movement, but because the air itself seemed to settle into a final shape, as if every possible outcome had already been accounted for except the one I had not yet chosen. The man at the door remained still, but his presence now felt less like an arrival and more like an anchor point for everything that had happened before. The newcomer beside me had not moved either, yet I could no longer think of him as someone observing. He felt integrated into the structure of what was unfolding, as if every sentence spoken in the last few minutes had been passing through him before reaching me. The man behind the counter finally placed both hands flat on the surface, a small gesture that felt more definitive than anything said so far. He stated calmly that remaining in the current position of uncertainty was no longer an option, not because of urgency, but because of completion. The word completion made my thoughts slow again, as if my mind had to process the idea that something could be finished without my agreement. I asked quietly what exactly had been completed, but even as I asked, I realized I was no longer expecting a simple answer. The man at the door looked directly at me and said that the point of connection had already been reached the moment I interacted with the wallet, and everything since then had only been confirmation of that contact. I felt a strange pressure in my chest at the simplicity of how he described it, as if my entire night had been reduced to a single irreversible action I did not fully understand when I performed it. I glanced toward the counter again, but the wallet was no longer visible at all, and its absence felt more significant than its presence had ever been. The newcomer finally spoke again, telling me that my earlier question about whether I had done something wrong was not relevant anymore, because the framework being used did not categorize events in moral terms, only in terms of resolution. That word, resolution, made something inside me shift, because it suggested that whatever was happening did not require my understanding to continue forward. I asked if I was being detained or if I was free to leave, and for the first time, there was a pause long enough to feel meaningful. The man behind the counter answered that I was physically free to leave at any moment, but that leaving would not necessarily remove me from the conditions already established. The distinction between physical freedom and something else I could not name made the room feel smaller, even though nothing had changed in its size. I looked toward the door again, noticing that the rain outside had not changed in intensity, but now it felt distant, as if it belonged to a different layer of reality than the one I was currently in. The man at the door stepped slightly closer to the threshold, but did not cross it, and he said that what mattered now was not what I chose, but what I understood about the fact that the choice had already been observed. That sentence settled into silence in a way that made every previous explanation feel like preparation rather than clarification. I realized then that no one in the room was trying to convince me of anything anymore, because conviction was not the objective. Understanding was. And in that moment, standing in a quiet convenience store while rain continued to fall outside, I understood that my life had already been divided into before and after without me ever witnessing the exact moment it happened. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences before it, because this one no longer carried uncertainty or anticipation. It carried completion. No one in the room was speaking now, and even the smallest sounds, like the faint hum of refrigeration or the soft distortion of rain against glass, felt distant, as if they belonged to another environment entirely. I stood still, aware that my body had stopped reacting with urgency and had shifted instead into something quieter, something closer to acceptance without understanding. The man at the door finally stepped fully inside, no longer positioned at the threshold, and that small movement changed the entire geometry of the room. It was no longer a space divided by roles or intentions. It felt unified under a single point of awareness, and that point was me. The newcomer beside me spoke first, breaking the silence with a calmness that no longer felt explanatory, only concluding. He said that the observation phase had ended, and that the result had been recorded. The man behind the counter confirmed this without looking up, as if reading something that did not require interpretation. My mind struggled to attach meaning to the word observation, because it implied that everything I had experienced, since finding the wallet had not been reaction, but monitoring. I asked, quietly, what exactly had been observed, and for the first time, the man at the door softened his expression slightly, not in sympathy, but in clarity. He told me that it was not my actions that mattered individually, but the consistency of my decisions under conditions I had not been aware of. He explained that the wallet was not a lost object in the traditional sense, but a controlled variable, placed within circulation to confirm behavioral response. The words should have felt impossible, yet they settled into the room with a kind of structured logic that made resistance difficult. I felt my thoughts slow again, not from fear, but from the realization that I had been trying to interpret something that was never meant to be random. The newcomer turned slightly toward me and said that nothing about my situation required panic, because outcomes had already been stabilized long before I entered the store. That phrase, stabilized, changed the way I understood everything that had happened. It suggested that the uncertainty I had been feeling was only on my side, not on theirs. I looked toward the counter again, but there was nothing left there except empty space where the wallet had once been, and even that emptiness felt intentional, as if the object itself had already completed its purpose. I asked one final question, not because I expected a different answer, but because I needed to understand where I now existed within all of this. I asked if I was in danger. The man at the door paused briefly before responding, and when he did, his answer was not what I expected. He said that danger was no longer the correct category for what surrounded me, because nothing here was acting against me. It was acting around me. The distinction was subtle, but it shifted something inside my perception that I could not reverse. He then added that the person associated with the name Dominic Moretti had not been pursuing me in the way I had assumed, but had instead been ensuring that I remained within a defined boundary of awareness until confirmation was complete. Hearing that name again grounded everything. into a single point I could no longer avoid. I realized then that I had never been the center of pursuit or escape, but the center of observation. The man at the door finally stepped slightly aside, not blocking the exit anymore, and said that what I chose next would not change what had already been recorded, only how I would understand it moving forward. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything collapse into a single quiet realization that my life had not been interrupted by a random night, but briefly aligned with something structured, deliberate, and already in motion long before I ever stepped into the ring.